Hi, everyone. My name is Jialian Yang. My pronouns are she and they. I am the Senior Director of Storytelling and Communications at Ford through Ferguson, and I'm really glad that you're here today for the Transforming 911 Part 2 release event. Yes, it's Part 2. So if you haven't checked out Part 1, it is online at transforming911.org. After this event is over, we'll put up this new report on there, as well as some additional stories and quotes from St. Louis residents. But that's a good place to check out why we're doing Transforming 911. Some of the research that we did prior focused on St. Louis County, and that was analyzing over 1.7 million 911 calls made to St. Louis County Police Department. So in case you're not familiar with Ford through Ferguson, let me give you a rundown. Raise your hand if you are familiar with Ford through Ferguson. A lot of you in this room, wonderful. And a specific shout out to the Ford through Ferguson staff members and board members who are here. We are the Anti-Racist Systems Change organization that was established after the Ferguson uprising. And since so many of you are familiar with Ford through Ferguson, I'm not gonna give you such a long spiel, but again, keep up to date with us at fordthroughferguson.org. We are still doing this work. And one of the things that we are really proud of is that recently we came out with another new report in addition to the one that you have on your table. So there is a group called Policies for Action out of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that is housed in the Urban Institute. And they were able to do a report exploring what has happened and what has and hasn't changed since the Ferguson Commission and some of those lessons from the Commission's approach. So we're still here centering impacted communities and mobilizing accountable bodies to advance racially equitable systems and policies to ensure all people in the St. Louis region can thrive. And data and research is part of that. Community building is part of that as well. Transforming 911 is a combination of things. First of all, it's a community accountability and advocacy tool. So what that means is whether it's the report in your hand or the online tool or photo and video stories, you can use that to talk to elected leaders, to people in power about how we can shift the 911 system. And I do want to note that there are elected officials who have registered for this webinar. They may be in this room, they may be in the online room. And so we want to show that we as people are paying attention and that we know what it takes for the communities to have what they need. So we have examined the 911 data. So that again means call for service data, but also refers to what are police doing with their time, because police are most often, if not 100% of the time, those folks who are responding to emergencies. We also have stories from St. Louis residents and also looking at the landscape. A lot of people don't know what happens after you call 911. So one of the things that we talk about is that there's geolocation happening. And a lot of people didn't know that if a public safety answering point is not upgraded to next generation 911, which is a software, that we're actually using the old landline technology. Imagine that, right? So some of us get food via delivery app nowadays. I hear robots are doing that now as well. Those are using cell phone location data, but 911, which is our 24/7 funded service to answer calls for emergencies, are using that old technology. So if you go to the end of this report, when you get home, you can see which places in the St. Louis region have upgraded to the next generation 911, hint St. Louis County and St. Charles County, and which have not. St. Louis City, to my knowledge, has not upgraded yet. It is also a call to reimagine and transform public safety. Like one of the folks attending has mentioned, this system is not working for everyone. And one of the things that we just talked about as we were talking as panelists was that it is a one-size-fits-all approach right now. It's not particularly individualized and it's not necessarily that flexible. So we're hoping that we can shift to a public safety system that is more community-based. This is a timeline of transforming 911. I'm not going to go into every single piece of detail because that is on the Transforming 911 website. But we want to let you know that we've been doing this work as early as 2019, specifically around Transforming 911. Of course, if you go back to when the Ferguson Commission was happening, that's 2015, even 2014. there was a Justice for All priority action or signature priority that we were focusing on. But specifically in Ferguson, O'Fallon Park, Dutchtown, we had community meetings where residents were saying 911 response was a top priority. They wanted to see something different. And as we educated people about how policing works in St. Louis, how does it work, and what are some of the limitations and also the functions of policing, then people were saying, can we look to models around the country that are working? And one of the things that we identified was the first responder alternative programs. So they go under different names in cities across the country, but it stands that those are programs where highly trained, compassionate civilians are able to respond to people. And this can alleviate the burden on the existing 911 system. So we released our first report in 2023, specifically around St. Louis County. And then something started happening where news outlets and also different residents would reach out to us because we all of a sudden became this expert on 911. And that specifically around the data and research. So when there were storms, remember when there were storms in the summer, they were really bad storms? Raise your hand. Okay, and then raise your hand if you remember when snowstorms were happening and people couldn't get out, okay? So there's a lot of climate crises that were happening here in the St. Louis region, and sometimes there were fatalities, there was suffering, and for us at 4th through Ferguson, it was like we were seeing the failures of the system that we had in responding to those crises. So we've been talking also to residents about what they want if we were to implement a first responder alternative program, because the idea is that we're not just talking about data and research, but that we will eventually be able to advocate and implement a pilot. And from a pilot, you can move to a program. From a program, you can move to other programs. So now we're at 2026, where we are releasing Transforming 911 Part 2, and that's analyzing over 1.3 million 911 calls made to St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. So something I want to address is that this data is outdated. I want to be entirely frank about that. This data is from 2017 to 2019. And what happened was that St. Louis County call data was pretty easy for us to get relative to getting data from St. Louis City. So that took a little bit longer to get data from the city. But also, as you remember, raise your hand if you remember the pandemic. Okay, okay, come on, right? Who didn't? And then raise your hand if you remember the tornado of last year. Okay, both of these disasters are ongoing for a lot of us, right? The pandemic has taken different forms. Health and learning has changed for students and kids. And then for the tornado, a lot of folks are still unhoused. A lot of folks on today, I'm really glad that it rained because it cooled things off, but it also means rain damage for people without homes or people whose homes were damaged, and then mold and other issues come about. So a lot of things have changed since the data in this report, but something that we felt like at 4th through Ferguson was really important was to be able to put this data into your hands so that we can kind of understand if the system hasn't changed substantially, then maybe we can assume some of these things are still a reality. I would assume, maybe not perfectly, that there are different call response times depending on which neighborhood you're in. That's one of the pieces of data we found, right? So some of the questions that we made sure to ask were, why do St. Louisans call 911? And also, how does that data help us transforming public safety system into one that best and most equitably meets the needs of St. Louis residents? So different ones of us might be shy about the word equitable, but for us at 4th through Ferguson, it's a very important word. It means that no matter which zip code and neighborhood you're in, you can expect to get a similar response to the need that you're having. I want to acknowledge that I did write a lot of this. It doesn't mean that I am going to have everything memorized. I want to thank Anissa for editing this report. Kevin McCoy did the report design, and AH Datalytics was our data partner. We have David, Fabra, Gina, Center for Policing Equity, and the City of St. Louis that helped us with the data transfer. So like I mentioned, we had two major questions, but specifically in the report, you can find that it's organized by these other additional questions. Our first report was much more of a narrative, maybe something that you'd find in a scholarly journal. This one was much more of a, here's our question, this is the answer. And there will be tables that have that specific information in it as well. Like I mentioned, it gives us insights into why residents are calling 911 and also how those response times vary across the city. And then also how St. Louis police officers are spending their time with regard to the types of calls, where the calls are coming from, and different neighborhoods. And these are the different call for service categories. We have service, miscellaneous policing, traffic, property, medical, society, and person. And so this NERVIS acronym, which I'm not going to read out, you can Google it. It's basically the type of categories that the FBI uses to categorize different types of calls. And also a lot of these categories will be aligned with crime categories, but I put crime in quotes because crime is, it really depends on how you're defining it. And so what I want to get into is the major parts of this data, which really show that most of the reasons that why people are calling 911 is not for what you would consider major crime. They're not even necessarily for harm done against a person. And when we're defining data, we're talking about response time. That's the number of minutes it takes for the first responding unit to arrive on the scene. And so we excluded a lot of these officer initiated calls because police officers, when they're going out to do something, that is also classified as a call for service. So we were excluding that from the data. So getting into the top findings and stories, I'm going to take a sip of water. And in that time, I would love for you to flip in your report to the categories of the calls for service, because then you can better understand what I'm talking about. And when you found it, raise your hand. I don't know why I've turned this into a classroom. It's probably like all these chairs and tables. We're all learning. I'm learning. And you know it's online so far? And if you're online, feel free to chat. You're not going to disrupt us here in person, but I'd love to know what you're thinking as well. Okay, raise your hand if you got that page. Okay, what page is it? 8, 10? I heard 2 different answers. 8, all right, page 8, okay. So I'm not going to explain it all to you. My memory's a little funny because I'm a little tired. All right, so I'm going to go through the top findings. So that means I'm not going to tell you everything that we found, but I'm going to tell you some of the things that jumped out to us as we were looking at it. And again, keep in mind that this data is outdated. It is from 2017 to 2019, but it's still important to know. So like I mentioned, most of the 911 calls are not for major crimes. So it's not what, you know, if you're really into crime shows, raise your hand if that's your guilty hobby. I know some of you are out there. Okay, crime podcast, anyone? Okay, no shame, no shame. Okay, so the things that you're hearing about in that media is not what people in St. Louis are really calling 911 about. Raise your hand if that's surprising to you. Okay, a little surprised and a little not surprised. Interesting. So less than 3% of the 911 calls were for attacks on a person. So that's including homicide, rape, robbery, and assault. Most of the calls for service were actually for service. That sounds really redundant, but again, that's because we're using those categories that I mentioned. So can someone read out for me what service as a category means? I'll run to you. Ready? Who's got it for me? Anyone? What does service mean?
Incidents that involve responding to community issues that are typically non-criminal, such as responding to a disturbance, taking a report on a missing person, or chasing an escaped or loose animal.
Okay, so people raise their eyes about chasing a loose animal. Okay, you're laughing, but I personally have heard people get attacked by dogs. Some people have really little dogs and other people have off-leash bigger dogs. Maybe sometimes the little dogs are attacking more, okay? That happens. And when they need help, raccoons, hello? Okay, who's got miscellaneous policing?
Responding to crimes such as performing maintenance, administrative duties, patrolling, or transporting a prisoner. Administrative incidents are a catch call category that reflects the time an officer spends not directly serving community members.
All right, and I just want to put an asterisk on prisoner because using first language, it's someone who's being transported, right? Sometimes that person might not have been charged, right? Sometimes they might have been picked up for any number of reasons. So we're just gonna put it at that. So we have resident stories in this report as well. We have Maren here. Thank you so much for being here, Maren, and sharing your story. And I just want to just kind of thank every person who's shared their stories with us. It's not easy to share their stories. And her story was about property damage, right? So she lives somewhere. There were cars that were broken into. And one of the things that stood out to me with her story is that both for her and her fiance, they wanted resolution about that incident that didn't involve ruining whoever did the incident, right? Whoever smashed the windows. It didn't involve ruining that person's life. What I heard was that they wanted the bottom sentence, it was more for the system to work itself out with insurance. So they wanted to be able to get their cars repaired and go back to their lives where they have a car that's whole and they didn't have to go out of their pockets with it. And so unfortunately, our current system is that everything has to be documented in order for that to happen. And I say unfortunately, not necessarily as a judgment, but because our current 911 system is very one size fits all. No matter what, when you're calling 911, you're gonna get a police officer coming out, they're gonna have a gun, they're gonna have a badge. You're not necessarily sure what they've dealt with the whole day prior to that. You don't know how long their shift has been. You don't know how they approach things, whether they see everyone as a threat or if there's someone who knows everyone else, right? And it just wants to assist whoever. So this is just an example of just how the system is not flexible to meet every single need that is out there, even if most of the calls are just like this. Raise your hand if you've ever called 911 because of a property issue. Okay, so other people as well in this room even. Okay, so the average response time that we found was 15 minutes. Highest priority calls average 5 minutes. Low priority calls average 23 minutes. And I'm really excited to get to our panel, and so I'll probably have to speed this along because when we talk to Dr. Punch, one of the things that always hits me with what he shares is that time is life. In an emergency, you do not want to be twiddling your thumbs. Even seconds matter, right? So 70% of priority 1 calls were for those person incidents, and you can read what those are about. And then 16% were for traffic, entirely accidents. And the average response time for those priority 1 calls were, like I mentioned, around 5 minutes. So this is a story from Suzanne. They submitted it through a form that we had collecting stories. So there's no photo with them because I didn't meet up with them. Suzanne experienced a medical emergency. And I think a lot of us, if we had a medical emergency, might call 911, whether it's to get transported to the right place or get help right then and there, because the EMTs can do that. Well, this person ended up waiting. Can someone read what happened at the bottom? 2 hours, okay? Raise your hand if you'd like to wait 2 hours during a medical emergency. Why are your hands not moving? I don't get it. Okay, so the problem that Suzanne said was that the dispatcher had coded the call the lowest priority. The call should have been coded the highest priority with the fire truck sent as well to help them get down the stairs. So one of the things that we know, and you can see this in the recommendation section, we had recommendations from the 2023 report, and what we did was look and update and see what has and hasn't changed since then, both city and county. And one of the issues is that different public safety answering points, which is where the 911 calls are dispatched out of, might have different call codes. Raise your hand if that's news to you. Okay, and so a call code is really like different letters that say like what type of call it is. And so there's different trainings, there's different protocols, there's different codes, depending on what public safety answering point you're in. So this fragmentation can have real life and death consequences for St. Louisans. And one of the things that also stuck out to me is I think anyone who's in St. Louis for a while becomes somewhat of a map nerd. Raise your hand if you're fascinated by maps. Okay, come on, y'all. You ever go to the library and go to those pull-out drawers? Exactly. That's where the good stuff is, okay? So on average, officers are responded slowest to 911 calls in Riverview, Skinner to Bolivar, and Bannerman at 17 and a half to 22 minutes. And on average, they were responding fastest to 911 calls in Botanical Gardens, Northampton, and Southwest Garden, 12 to 13 minutes. So I'm sure all of us, yes, Anissa.
We have a question from someone in the Zoom chat asking, what happens to the dispatcher when a call is miscoded? Where is the accountability held?
I think it's tough. I don't personally know how the disciplinary or accountability processes work specifically for dispatchers, but what I can tell you is that dispatching really difficult profession. It is very low paid. And raise your hand if this fact is new to you. Dispatchers have higher rates PTSD than police officers. Raise your hand if you never heard that before. Okay, yeah, so when you think about it, these are people who are fielding difficult calls day in and day out. They're also fielding annoying calls because there are people who are using 911 for reasons they don't need to be using. Now, some of us may have seen those viral videos of the little kid who's bored and calls 911. Okay, that exists. But there's also deadly 911 calls where people are calling because they think someone doesn't look like they belong in the neighborhood. Okay, and that can lead to disastrous consequences. They're dealing with those calls as well. And they're doing those in shifts that may vary in time, maybe for way longer than they need to. What I do know from talking to at least one dispatcher is that they're understaffed and their opportunities for advancement may vary and may not be as much as they'd like. Also, one major factor, which may not seem like a big deal, is that they cannot customize their workspace. So imagine being somewhere for hours. And most of us who work are somewhere that is not our home for hours, unless you work from home. And even then, that's like your workplace, right? They cannot customize it. No pictures of the family, none of their favorite snacks or things they like, because it's a shared space. What I want to say in response to that is that accountability is really important, but I want us to think about the systemic nature of what happens when you have people who are answering 911 calls under pretty difficult circumstances. How can we address those factors and what they deal with and address the response after that? This is a quote from Linda Daly, and you can read it later when I send this to you via email, that she is in Columbus Square, Cambridge Heights, that's close to downtown, and she shared that their 911 calls aren't getting answered to. And so that's difficult. Speaks to how you might have different responses depending on what neighborhood you live in. Like I mentioned, we did examine how police officers are spending their time. Most of the time, they're responding to 911 calls for service, miscellaneous policing, and traffic. It kind of maps up to why residents are calling. But when we think about what police officers are trained and equipped to do, I want us to think about what that means, that every time they're going with a badge and a gun, or no matter what situation it is, and they're dealing with an enormous volume of calls. And these different calls are being dispatched through public safety answering points that have extremely fragmented or different ways of approaching things, whether that's training, protocols, codes, even the software, right? And so these person calls accounted for around 3% of incidents, but they spend more time on scene for those. And it can be even up to an hour and 43 minutes per incident. And this stuck out to me again for the same reasons that we talked about earlier, the map thing, the different neighborhoods thing. Police officers are spending 20% of their time responding to calls in just 5 neighborhoods in St. Louis City. And by our spending, I mean in the snapshot of time they were spending. Dutchtown, downtown, Central West End, Carondelet, and Downtown West. Over a fifth of their time on miscellaneous policing and medical calls in those 5 neighborhoods. And a third of their time was on scene to community-initiated 911 calls regarding disturbances. This was interesting to me because I feel like that's kind of a broad category. Disturbance, what does that mean? Maybe someone's being loud. Maybe an animal's being loud. Maybe you're concerned about some sort of commotion. So basically they want someone to go out there. This resident wants someone to go out there and check something out because they don't feel equipped to do so. Okay. And police officers are spending most of their time on scene for incidents that do not involve violence. This goes into conversations about the budget, where this year was a very contentious year for the St. Louis City budget. We had the state takeover of police factoring into that. There were a lot of debates, a lot of hours of testimony spent on where should our money be going to. And a majority of the public safety budget is going to police. And this is pretty usual, but the amount that we're talking about is more than past years. And then you look at the fraction for health and hospitals and human services. So something a lot of folks who are advocating for holistic public safety would say is that for every dollar spent on policing, only 1 cent is spent on health and human services in the city. At this point, it's less than 1 cent, okay? Imagine cutting a penny into fractions. We're not even using the penny anymore, okay? So before pressure from organizers, the Board of Alders, you can see here, did not allocate any money to the Office of Violence Prevention. We have some folks, I think, that have opinions about that in this room, Violence Prevention Commission members, to be exact. So transforming 911 still matters. That is a stance that Forward Through Ferguson has. And now I'd like to invite our speakers up to share with us.
I'm Jordan Palmer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Crisis Services Specialist at the Missouri Department of Mental Health. And I help oversee programs that provide mental health crisis services to the entire state.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Russell. I'm a certified emergency manager. I am the former commissioner of emergency management for the city of St. Louis. This is the 1-year anniversary, by the way. So thank you for being here with me. And I am currently the co-chair of the Local Emergency Planning Commission, which is a voluntary group that is a requirement by the EPA for community right to know, and has to deal with primarily hazardous materials planning, involves community members, first responders, government representatives, and any community organizations or members that would like to participate in that. And I did, this is my 3rd day on my new job. I joined Paraquad this week as the Director of Facilities and Transportation for them. So new adventure.
So all of these people are amazing, have great expertise. I want to just give them a hand for being here because some of them are going back to their jobs right after this. And some of them have had long days. So I'm really thankful for you, Dr. Punch, for everything that you've done with tornado response and innovative thinking about emergency response. So I'm really excited to talk to you. Jordan, thank you so much for being here. Casey Muckler is someone from the Missouri Department of Mental Health that we've had a good relationship with, because every time we have a Transforming 911 report, people ask, what about 988? Raise your hand if you know about 988. Okay, and if you don't, we're going to get into it. So thank you so much, Jordan, for being able to share where 988 is at today. And Sarah, thank you so much for being here. You worked for many years in emergency planning. You have a wealth of experience, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you as well. So the question I want to start with is, time is life. I'm quoting Dr. Punch here. If you go to transforming911.org, the second video, I believe, features an interview with Dr. Punch with that phrase. And that was the first time I'd heard that phrase used. We're not always thinking about emergency response. Let's be honest. It's like when we least want to think about it, that we think about it, most of us. And Dr. Punch said this phrase as something about basically like the call response time, but just in general, when you need something, you want it fast, you want it accurate, and you want it to meet your needs. So I just want all of you to share a little bit about what time is life that phrase means for you in the context of emergency response.
So again, I'm a trauma surgeon by training, and it means that for a couple of decades of my life, I've worked on the edge of the clock at a place actually in Baltimore that coined the term the golden hour, which is the hour after someone has been injured, in which literally every second can bring them closer to death, and time is everything. But as a community health practitioner, what it means to me now is radically different, because I learned that I could stitch someone up with gold and be as ready as possible inside an institution. But the truth is, the best help is the closest. And so now I'm really fascinated by what that means to help people activate the power that they have when they are close to others, because the fastest response is the nearest response. So time is life for me used to mean life is on the line, you go fast. Now it means life is precious. We should all be ready to serve our neighbor.
Yeah, so from the 988 perspective, we know that whenever someone's reaching out to 988, they are going through something. So we don't want them to just be sitting on hold, waiting, hearing that music, like you're on hold. And so we really prioritize making sure that people are connected to our 988 crisis specialist as soon as possible. And we actually hold pretty consistently one of the fastest answering times in the country for response time.
I'm a little bit different coming from an emergency management perspective, but definitely, in alignment with what they've both said, but particularly Dr. Punch, and thinking about the ways that, we have before that crisis hits to educate and help prepare people and encourage people, whatever their background is, whether it's a student in a high school program, just a community member, a retiree, anyone, a scouting group, to be able to take training, to be able to act when you're that person that's next to someone that needs that help, whether it's stop the bleed, community emergency response training, CPR, AED, all of those type of things, Heimlich maneuver, anything that you can, through just a little training, a little of your time and understanding, give of yourself to help the person next to you when it matters the most for them.
I'm really excited to get into the idea that residents and people are often the best responders in disasters because they're closest, and also for other reasons. But before we get into that, I want to talk about first responder alternatives. So like I mentioned, these are models that exist across the country for emergency response. They have been tested, and oftentimes they will not only be able to divert 911 calls, but also do it without needing police backup at all. So the reason why I want to talk about that is not only because residents have told us that that's what they want in 911 and emergency response. They want compassionate, trained civilians to be able to respond to emergencies. But also when we had community meetings and asked people, what do you want in a first responder alternative pilot? Often people would talk about mental health and behavioral health issues. Now, that wasn't necessarily the top category that we saw for this St. Louis City research, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. It doesn't mean that it's not top of mind, and it doesn't mean that it's not something that people really wrestle with. Because one of the stories from what residents that we were sharing was that they had a loved one who had mental health crises. These are multiple stories actually from residents. And so what do you do when a loved one is potentially harming or themselves or others, right? How do you get them the help that they need without throwing them into the carceral system, without them experiencing harm? So Jordan, could you speak about what 988 is and how does that relate to diverting 911 calls?
Yeah, so 998 is a free and confidential phone line similar to 911, but it's specifically for people who are experiencing some type of behavioral health, suicide, substance use crisis, or just any type of emotional distress. And it's available 24/7 all across the state. And that's just one of our essential pillars of the crisis system for Missouri. So we have our someone to call, 988, someone to respond, which is our mobile crisis response providers, and then somewhere to go or behavioral health crisis centers, which function similar to like urgent cares. So diving into the mobile crisis response is very similar to the models you've been talking about. It is whenever someone might need a little bit more support than, cell phone, they need someone to actually come to them and to provide them with support. We can send out trained professionals to wherever they are in the community. So that could be their house, that could be a gas station, that could be a school for kiddos. It could be anywhere in the community, and it's available 24/7 across the state. And it does not require any type of first responder involvement.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that struck me is that, and you've got these postcards up here, is that the Missouri Department of Mental Health recently released a 988 to 911 toolkit. Did I get that right?
Yeah, our 988 911 partnership toolkit.
Okay, perfect. So basically, like I mentioned, public safety answering points are the places where the 911 calls are being dispatched out of. And whenever they take on a new program, that's something that they elect to. And so the toolkit is supposed to help them with that. Right now, it sounds like you're in the awareness stage of getting residents to know 988 exists, but also socializing this toolkit among public safety answering points and trying to get them to take that on, correct?
Yeah, so our 988 centers are great about trying to engage different community partners in their community across the state. And some of those partners are our 911 PSAPs. And so we put together a work group that developed this toolkit to kind of help facilitate those conversations and facilitate those partnerships across the state. Because ultimately we want, behavioral health calls that when someone just needs someone to talk to and help them and connect them to resources, we want those calls to be coming to 988 and to help divert from the 911 system, because we understand, how much is being placed on the system, and we want to be able to help in the ways that we can.
Thank you. So, Sarah, I'd love to open up the conversation about streamlining the 911 system, because there are all different working parts of the 911 system. So like I mentioned, there's all of these different public safety answering points, believe like 53 in St. Louis County. And that, you think about the 79 municipalities, it used to be 88, right? And there's 15 police departments in St. Louis County. And then there's St. Louis City. So it's, all the big St. Louis City, right? But we also heard and saw that if the data is similar several years ago to now, that you can experience different 911 response times depending on what neighborhood you're in. And not only that, there's probably different factors relating to that. So there might be the geolocation part, there might be the training protocol codes part. And then there also is that there's different folks that they're sending out. There's police, which happens 100% of the time, even for behavioral health instances. So unless they're getting 988, there's always going to be a police officer involved. But then there are also fire and EMS. So Sarah, tell me about what streamlining the 911 system means to you.
So to give you a little bit of background, I was, up until last year, I was the Commissioner of Emergency Management for the city. And that was a role that I was promoted to at the end of May of 2021. It was May 27th. It was an anniversary of a historic tornado here in St. Louis. And the very next day, I got a call tasking me with writing a program plan to consolidate the 3 dispatch centers, police, fire, and EMS, into a streamlined system. So looking at combining them physically, because we were planning for a new facility to house all of us, putting together the pay charts, training matrices, streamlining and putting everybody on the same job titles, job descriptions. Again, the training programs, call takers, and all of that as well. And then the potential for bringing those and partnering the PSAP, as everyone refers to it now, and I think more people are understanding, along with the EOC and emergency management, which is the Emergency Operations Center. that becomes the hub of where all of the decisions are made during a greater emergency. If you think about 911 receiving a call, typically one person or a small group of people. The EOC gets more calls when it's a greater group of people. So I was tasked with doing that on my second day of the job, and I was on vacation. So promptly by getting back, I was already thinking and putting that together. Looking at combining those centers really to me makes sense. I am a community member. I've used 911. I know what the difficulties have been. There was an evening when my wife and I returned home from being out, and we saw red taillights in the garage window of our neighbor's house. And it kind of clicked with both of us that that's something that needs to be examined. We were very close with our neighbor. We knew things that were going on, and we acted very quickly to go find out what was happening. And what was happening is what you may imagine. It was not a good scenario, and my neighbor needed help urgently. My wife attended to her directly, and I called 911. I use 911 on a daily, not a daily basis, but on a regular basis, being an emergency management person and a person who worked for the city. Making sure that people were getting help that they needed, or trying to. When I called 911, I was standing in the alley. I called and I got the dispatch center for SLMPD. I didn't need SLMPD. We had access to the garage. We were in the alley. We were stable. There was no hazard there. We needed EMS. So I had to get transferred over to the fire department and EMS. I don't recall if I had to get transferred twice or just once, but there was already that delay. I had to explain to the police dispatcher what was going on and what I needed. And then I had to repeat myself and explain it to another dispatcher. And then I had to wait at the end of the alley to direct the ambulance when they got there. So there are delays there. If everybody is consolidated in the same room, and that's very different than co-located, which my last understanding of the project overall and looking at this type of transformation internally was that it was creeping back to a co-location model, meaning that somebody, mentioned at one point in the planning meetings about putting glass partitions up in the floor. Like everybody would sit on the same floor and we could see each other and have additional visibility, but we were still going to be divided groups of dispatchers. So limitations.
I thought of a metaphor, and forgive me if this is really silly. St. Louis City and St. Louis County are co-located in the St. Louis region, but St. Louis Public Library and St. Louis County Library are consolidated. Would you say that?
I have your cards. I have both library cards.
We love the library here.
But yeah, you're still, we worked for many years to plan and finally have the ground broken on this facility that's going to help bring us all together to be able to work and lean on each other. From part of that perspective was to integrate emergency management more closely with dispatch, which is great because how many times as an emergency manager or a commissioner did I learn about an incident that we should have been able to support on Twitter? Because we didn't get information directly from dispatch. We didn't usually get information for a long time from any of the other agencies that would have responded. There was a lot of times I got it on Twitter, and then I would get it also from the Red Cross because someone had called for canteen services because they were going to be out working in the field on, a gas leak or something for an extended period of time, and they needed to be taken care of. And then the Red Cross would call me and say, "Hey, what's going on?" And I would say, "What did you mean?" So I would get the notification from the Red Cross because somebody wanted coffee or snacks.
So let's pause right there because I'm hearing so many fun sounds from Dr. Punch, like real talk. And so I want to give you a chance to chat. Dr. Punch, what is going through your mind right now about how people are getting information, how things could be better streamlined, why people know things first? We're not going to talk about Twitter, X, which people are really not using anymore, but tell me what you're thinking.
So if you'll forgive me, it's very hard for me to think about these things without understanding the history and the structure, because what we're discussing right now is nonsense, right? How could we just said time is life. How is Twitter the mediator, right? In 1967, three things happened that created our current reality. One was the Kerr Commission, which was a review of race and civil relationships, violence, and unrest. The second was the Law Enforcement Commission, looking to optimize law enforcement. And the third was the creation of the Freedom House paramedics, the first system of medical first response created by previously incarcerated Black men in Pittsburgh. All of those things happened the same year.
Breath in and out. And I wanted us to do that because we're processing new information. Some of you might be thinking about this in a way that you haven't before. Some of you might be thinking, what does this mean? What's next? And that's why we're all here, transforming 911. So transforming is about shifting, about changing systems. And at Ford through Ferguson, we are about systems change. Reforming is taking a system and just tweaking a few things about it, but the function of the system remains. And so I do want all of you to talk about from your experiences about trust with 911, because inevitably, when we talk about okay. All right, there we go. Okay, well, never mind, panelists. The audience already responded. There were thumbs down. There was, we don't have it. Okay.
Well, I think maybe I have, coming from a different perspective of, yes, having felt that from a community perspective, especially when, we were going through that period of so many people being waiting on hold and getting hung up or disconnected inadvertently, whatever happened. But from an internal perspective, knowing that, there were difficulties in getting that information. Now, we did start to kind of put together a little bit of patchwork. So for a while, I got every stuck elevator in the city of St. Louis on text message, every just general fire, one building fire, which was kind of the exact opposite of what I actually needed, which was if it's an apartment building, something that is a larger scale, that an emergency management function would have been able to assist with. But looking at it from that perspective, I was also very guarded of the dispatch centers and really pushing to try and have the dispatcher themselves be the one that provided us that information, knowing how short-staffed, knowing how tasked they were already, thinking primarily police dispatch. We talked about they're taking the calls, they're sometimes giving directions and doing things, but a lot of times they're also listening to the radios from officers that are on the street that are also relaying information. So being short-staffed and having to be in the middle of that amplifies that task, that stress for them, especially in its most critical incidents. So trying to find ways to partner with them to improve that internally required an immense amount of trust. And I, personally had a lot more opportunity and felt much better about the way that I was able to do that with police dispatch. They did annual training, which their training staff invited me to come and speak with them for an hour or more about what it is we do and how we could work better together. And it did help us to fix the miscellaneous tag. Doesn't include flooding, doesn't include flooded streets, closed down streets whenever the rain hits, which was something that I was trying to get better handle on so that we could collect data and improve warning people.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I do want to clarify for folks, when we're talking about dispatchers, there's different departments that do different dispatch, right? So there's police dispatchers, and then fire and EMS they have their own dispatchers. And then there's also consolidated dispatchers that do it for both. And so you might see that in the county. I saw Dr. Punch moving about again. Did you have something to say? No. Just being an active, present listener. I'm sure you all are burning with your questions. Raise your hand if you have a question.
Question on Zoom. Have any public safety labor groups been involved in any of the conversations regarding changing the PSAP model?
I will tell you that the report that I provided with the framework of what should have happened included the union groups. It included direct feedback from current employees, and certainly the unions were spelled out in that. My understanding of how that existed in actuality was it wasn't immediate. And certainly that was something that I said should have happened up front, that everybody needed to be in on the process of discussion from the start to make sure that everyone had that voice.
Yeah, and so when you flip to the back, the recommendations, there is one part about the idea of consolidating the dispatch and there was actually a project which Sarah was alluding to bring them all under one roof. There is a facility, and you can visit it on Jefferson, that is where that dispatch center should be. It is not complete. There have been several million ARPA dollars in ARPA funding that have been spent, but not all of them have been spent. If you go on the city's website, it will show that it's not all spent. Now, I don't know if it's that the website isn't updated or project's not done. Either way, looks like a construction site. Okay, so that's one. But the other thing is when you look, whether through press statements or not, the different unions have different interests and they may not always align. And something that I'm gathering both from looking at what people have said publicly and also conversation with you, Sarah, earlier, is that the folks who are doing this work don't want a plan pushed on them. And so no matter what happens with consolidation, it will need buy-in. It will need something that we talk about all the time at Forward Through Ferguson, co-design, working together with the folks who are enacting this work to make this happen. Okay, next question.
Yes, wanted to go back to, we talked about whether or not people were disciplined for miscategorizing a call. I actually want to know, what is the frequency of that actually happening, that people are doing that as dispatchers? And then for 988, can you clarify, because it sounds like it's a self-identifying, I call when I am in crisis, but can loved ones call when others are experiencing crises?
I'll start with the first question because it's a very short answer. We don't know. At Forth and Ferguson, we have 911 call data, meaning when people are calling for service, we know the categories, we know what they are, right, and how police are spending their time, but we don't know, we can't match up what the call codes are after they're calling 911 and why the person originally wanted to call. What we do know, and you can see that in the recommendation section, is that St. Louis County had a program to survey residents after their 911 calls, and it was cut because of budget cuts. So that's one. And two is that we just don't have very good data for 911. And that's one of our recommendations, that we need better data on why people are calling for help and what comes after that, so we can better address these questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much for bringing that up about 988, because that's something I did mean to say, is that anyone can call, even if you're worried about someone else, you can call and reach out to 988 and get resources to help that person, or help get that person connected to 988, help get that person connected to mobile crisis response. So anybody can reach out to 988.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Drake, she, her pronouns. I'm here as sort of a social work generalist and consultant. Also an advocate for survivors of intimate partner violence. And I'm working with the River City Journalism Fund on a 3-part series on preparedness. Thank you so much for each of you being here today. I'm gonna lay out some facts that I'm trying to reconcile here as both a practitioner and a student of history like Punch, and then also a person who wants to be active and helpful. So we've learned from John that dispatcher rates of PTSD are higher than police, or another way of saying that is that, being a dispatcher is more highly correlated with symptoms of post-traumatic stress than perhaps being like a beat cop. We know that something similar is true for people who experience intimate partner violence. So people who experience emotional abuse have higher rates of PTSD than people who experience physical violence at the hands of their partners. I think there's all types of reasons we could speculate as to why. But if you experience things like harassment, stalking, bullying at the hands of a partner, those behaviors are more highly correlated with PTSD than physical violence. We've also learned both here and I think through my personal experience that police really only respond urgently to calls when harm has already been perpetrated. So if you were sitting on the precipice, perhaps, like one way that I've started to conceptualize emotional abuse, because you can have emotional violence without physical violence, but you can't have intimate partner violence that's physical in nature without emotional abuse. Those things travel together. Most emotional abuse, however, is simply like pre-physical violence, right? The emotional abuse starts before the physical violence does. And so you may be a person who's sitting on the precipice of that physical violence because nobody's physically violent until they are, right? And the answer that I have certainly gotten back from law enforcement when I call 911 and other folks that I've worked with has been, they won't come do anything unless I've already been hit. And then we have sort of this thing that I'm grappling with, like this mental model that police are the only helpers. And police certainly live into that sort of designation as the helpers. But we also have like a public mental model. People really want police to be effective helpers. They want their first responders to be the people who can show up and be helpful. And I think one of the things that I hear the panelists describing is like that tinkering around the edges of reform is we're running into really stubborn, intractable challenges that make it almost impossible to be able to do that for people. So we have to find a way to like manipulate this mental model so that people feel comfortable doing it the other way. And then finally, the thing that I'm grappling with most personally, I think, is that every time I've called 988, and the most two recent times were frankly in the middle of a personal family violence episode, and then the time before that, I witnessed a person walk into a store in distress, and he was hollering. One of the people who was working there said, "Can you call 911?" I said, "No, but I'll call 988." The person on the line in both of those cases ultimately ended up routing me to 911. In the case of the person, when it was my family, I just hung up and went about my own business because I can do a better job, frankly. I've been at it longer than they have. And the time when it was another person experiencing this crisis, mental health crisis, I just stuck around until the cops showed up to make sure that he wasn't hauled off to jail because that's not what he needed. So what do we do with all of that? How do we untangle this idea that most of our systems are inefficient and sort of irreparably broken? I understand the idea of creating parallel systems. I think, and full disclosure, I have worked with Punch on some of their, what we call them, social enterprises, miracles that you do in public. And I think the challenge is that those things are expensive, both in sort of just financial resources, but also in the human cost. Like none of us can do any of this for very long. And so what does it take to build a people-powered system that is sustainable and responsive and effective, in your opinion, that perhaps relies somewhat on the existing systems, but like in other ways really subverts them to demonstrate that another future is possible?
Gorgeous question. Feel the tiredness in your voice.
That was a really good question, and
You put it on.
yeah, that was kind of a mic drop moment, if we're being honest. But I can at least speak to the 988 piece. I am very sorry that was your experience with it, but I want you to know that that is something we are constantly looking at quality improvement. And we're constantly seeing how we can do better, how we can train people better, how we can make sure stuff like that doesn't happen. Because, we do want to reduce reliance on emergency systems. We want to help, take some of the burden off of those systems. And so I am very sorry that your experience, and it is something that we're always looking at improving and looking at ways that we can train people better too, and looking at national best practices too.
I think this is my failure and my curiosity on the page, killing me softly. Because I think so much of the work I've done in St. Louis has been activating a healed future just to demonstrate that something wildly different is possible. Because what I saw when I first came to the city a decade ago was people who could not even imagine loving, tender care in prisons. Whether they were at risk for overdose, or had just been shot, or were struggling with a new serious health condition, or couldn't pay the light bill. So much of the work that I have done is trying to be an oasis, a hot spring in the mountains, something radically different from everything else. And that's a me, so I'm talking about me. But I have really had to reckon over the last couple of years as I tackle things that can only be addressed at a system level. There's a local guy, not a national guy, Thomas Apt, with the Save Lives Now initiative, who runs an initiative at the University of Maryland, the VRC, and it's about radical collaboration.
I'm hearing there's 2 more questions. I do want to get to Nina because, yeah, your hand was up from before the panel started, so.
Domestic violence stats, are they included in the people's stats that, because I guess I would have assumed that a lot of police calls were domestic violence.
I think so. I would double check the category and how it's described there. The difficulty is that every time we share transforming 911 data, I wish this was different. I really do. But people always want more detail than we can provide. People want to know, what are different zip codes calling for? Or, broken down within those categories, what types of things. And the fact is, we do need better data collection. That is part of it. So thank you for asking. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Well, I was gonna say, I'm aware of the wonderful work Dr. Punchy done with Stop the Bleed. I was wondering, is that rolled into something else, or did that not continue?
That's the first class of the Community First Responder Network. We've continued, probably taught at this point over 13,000 people in the region Stop the Bleed. And so we're going to be reigniting that and adding a lot more training. But I do want to go back one more thing I did not say to Jennifer's question, which is
I have worked in all systems of behavioral health, from incarceration, penal system, to education, to behavioral health currently now. And a lot of what Dr. Punch is saying is the mobilization of the movement of us, of educating and becoming educated amongst ourselves, because we keep us safe. A lot of times we so traumatized by systems of oppression that, like the behavioral health organization that comes out with the police, first responders, the what is it?
BHR,
Behavioral health response. We need more of those, not necessarily, in a capacity of, I think somebody should be out with every police to hold them accountable for things that they do, because I do see, in my own neighborhoods, before you get to, an event or whatever the violence that has taken place, that you already have formed in your head what's going to happen before you even have surveyed the area to find out what it is. So, in response to all of this, it really is a movement. It is about us organizing to understand that we all are the same, we all believe, and that harm happens to all of us in one form or another. So I would definitely agree with that, and thank you all.
That wasn't a question, but thanks for sharing.
Yeah, well, the question was answered. I mean, and then, well, my thing is, for you, not to come with outdated data and expect to get, answers, because it's like fluff work almost. I'm just wondering why this is 2026 coming into 27, and we're talking about stuff that happened before the pandemic. But it's a true thing. But I'm just wondering why bring data that's out it's so outdated. I mean, really, come on, for real.
So there were two options.
Yeah.
Was not to put it out in the
No, I
public
understand.
or to keep it. And for us, at least the way I view it,
Mhm.
it is the people's data. It
Mhm.
is data on real calls. And I felt like we owe it to people to share it. And then also my hope is that by keeping, providing updates from the 2023 response recommendations, that people can actually know what's going on. And also because there are so many events that have happened that show how urgent it is to transform 911. And Executive Director Anissa McCaskill is here with a word for us.
Any data is better than no data. And we did the St. Louis County report, and then this is the bookend. So it matches the time frame in which we were looking at the St. Louis County report. I will say, we have attempted to receive funding to be able to pull the data and do a more updated report. That has not happened. Because as we talk about consistently in the nonprofit space, priorities have shifted. But think of how many people have died. Think of how many people are in need. Think of how many things have changed politically with these systems that we're talking about that also have to be built in other spaces that are also not receiving funding. So we thought it was better to have some data that we could show what happens when people have a bit of it versus not doing anything at all. We wanted to make sure that we could bookmark what we do with St. Louis County, but we also wanted to do what we could with the data that we did have the funding for.
And there have been times when our data was outdated and we don't release it. And those are difficult decisions. And in those times, we usually just share stories, which don't get outdated.
Thank you. I was going to actually just leave my hand down, but let me just say, first of all, I want to give everybody on the panel flowers. All of you for your work and for your work in the past, your work now, and your work to come. I will say that Dr. Punch, you saying that like doing this parallel systems work right now is, you know, how much it is already transforming. St. Louis, of course, I believe everybody in the room could agree with you. And I think that as we push that forward, what that looks like. So my question is coming back to what could that look like from the rest of us? But before I ask that, so you could be thinking about it, but it is each of us that makes, you know, all of us have a place, and just, we all have a role in making this work for St. Louis and being a model across the country in our spaces that we are in. When I think about, and Sarah, I'm giving you your flowers, you may not remember this, but when the flood happened in 2022, it was Sarah who was with me on the ground in Ellendale, walking through flood water and sewage at 10 o'clock at night, going home to home, making sure our community members were safe. Nobody knows that story. I know you haven't told it, but I'm telling it. But because we did that, we were knocking on people's doors, trying to make sure that they were safe and alive and such. There were 911 calls that did not need to happen because we were going door to door as community members checking on people. And so just like that, when I also think about how even in the nursing space, I worked for a local hospital, a children's hospital, and I remember the police were about to be called on a family because there was a grief situation. It was a situation where a baby was going to pass. And the family was a Black family, and the family were screaming. And the staff thought that that was something that needed police attention because they were screaming. We have not dealt with the fact that different populations of people, different groups of people, different ethnicities, how we handle things differently. And then what is that education? And so with me being in that space, I was able to say, oh, no, this is just how, no. Like, you don't need to call the police for this. Just like in working in mental health, when I would call, because one of my patients was having an issue, and I knew that it was something that we tried to de-escalate and we could not. I called and I asked for a CIT. And I would say, do not send anyone here if you cannot send me a CIT. Well, we don't have one right here at the moment. Well, we're going to keep working until you have a CIT to send. That made the difference with so many with my psychopath patients, with my sociopath patients. That made such a difference. And so my point is, each and every one of us understanding the power that we have in our places right now. And so, Dr. Punch, I'm going back to you and anybody else on the stage. What does that look like for the rest of us as we are looking at parallel systems along with trying to figure out what we do with the current ones we have? Because let me just say we did get funding for 911 dispatch. I will say that was able to get that. But how do we do that right now?
David can't tell Goliath what to do. Maybe have us over for dinner next time. Because maybe we all want the same thing. We have to address the power differential here. I have tried.
You know, I'm gonna get real brief on the tornado. From the emergency operations standpoint, we knew what was happening in the O'Fallon Rec Center. I knew what was happening, and it was something that we traditionally would look to put in place, and we're looking to put things in place. And people went out to survey the areas and see what was functional, because we had a lot of damage in the places that we typically would rely on. And they saw firsthand what was happening at the O'Fallon Rec Center. And I had a conversation with someone who I no longer talk with. And I said, you know, this is a time unlike any disaster that St. Louis has had for a really long time. And I know that we've come off of a very contentious election, which was fresh on everyone. And I said, could you imagine the community that would be visible and built and strengthened if you took a truck of supplies up to the O'Fallon Rec Center and Mayor Tashara Jones met you with a fork truck to receive and offload those, and in turn, they were provided to the people that so desperately needed them. And later that night, I was put on.
Come on, Anna.
Well, I don't know how I can talk. Again, I'm gonna say it, mic drop moments, there's been lots of this today. But from the 90-day perspective and just kind of our behavioral health crisis system, I can say we are very focused on serving people in their community. So I know we've been very focused on St. Louis today. But we also look at what communities look like across the state for our crisis services. So like our rural crisis services look very different than St. Louis City or St. Louis County. And so we're making sure that our 988 centers, our mobile crisis response providers, our behavioral health urgent cares are equipped to meet people's needs in the communities they serve, not just kind of a blanket slate all across the state, because we recognize that different communities have different needs.
The other thing that I want to just put out there is there are people that work in your local, state, and federal government that are committed to making these things happen. We were developing that, and that's the workshop we were in on the day of the tornado. We were piloting that. We had people that were in the room that were not traditional ones that came together. Police and fire weren't there, but planning, CDA were there. Other departments were there with emergency management as we were watching radars. But having those conversations, identifying the internal issues that we have beyond just the silos that some people cannot and will not get out of, finding ways to work better together. Hate saying that, I'm sorry. Read the reason. But at the basic, we all have to be able to work with each other, internal to the government, and then being able to take that to the community. We built it initially to be community coming together to work with emergency managers and being able to work together to make sure that we were giving the right things to the right people, what they needed. Not when, you know, when we were out on the street, people wanted to send mac and cheese boxes to people who had been flooded. They couldn't do anything with that. They don't have water, they don't have power, making sure that you're getting what you need. But before we could really get into that conversation, we identified that we had to work on things in our own house of the city government to make sure that we were all working together. And what we found was that we were encountering the same challenges, but we were all working them separately. And that workshop was bringing us together. And now it hasn't really benefited, not everybody that was there went to work in the EOC for the tornado that afternoon, but it hasn't really impacted and benefited the city since then. But it has benefited others because now that's a program that you can pay to come to your community and have that done. And that's something else that we built here. So all of this to say, we know that there's been things nationwide that we've talked about already that are issues, and there are issues across the board. In St. Louis, we know we have a great, not always great history here that we have to contend with and deal with too. But I just please be open that there are some people hidden across your city government, maybe in some strange places, that you can trust that they want to make this work. I know that they're still out there. I'm always sad that I don't get to work with them anymore.
Thank you so much for being here with me today. Check out 314 Oasis. You have calendars of activities that happen. There are now drop-in times twice a week, correct? For hot meal support, etc.
5 days.
Never mind, I lied. I completely lied. And 988, there's information right here on the table. It's swag. Anything I'm missing, Jordan?
Feel free to take anything.
Okay, feel free to take anything. And Sarah, thank you so much for being here, and congrats on your job. Thank you all so much for coming. Please do mingle. And, I think it's okay that we had so many mic drop moments, but it's okay if we don't always have them. And sometimes it's okay to come away with more questions and answers. And my hope is that we come away with more accurate questions that can get us somewhere that we need to go. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.